So it's like a game of chicken. You guys are spinning with each other?
We'd spin, literally side by side, but we'd be spinning at the same time. And when I'd recover, Ron would always still be going.
Oh my gosh.
About halfway up the thing, he firewalls it. And I'm like, this can't possibly end well. He got in the air, went past us, goes into the fog, and we're just waiting for the impact.
Welcome to the Coffee and a Hanger podcast. My guest today is Art Warbelow, founder of Warbelow's Air Ventures in Fairbanks, Alaska. Art shares with us his story of how him and his brothers, as teenagers, struggled to salvage the remains of their late father's flying service. Every lesson has a story, and Art is generous to share it all. Part 2 of this interview will be aired in about a month, so remember to subscribe so you don't miss out.
And we had a very short runway at Cathedral. It was about 900 feet long, and it was down a hill. We never used it. We landed on the road, but we had to have cover. So we had
cover so that you wouldn't get in trouble.
Yeah, because it was illegal at that time to land on the road, and the territorial police and the Alaska State Troopers spent years trying to pin my dad on landing on the road there. But we were always like, oh no, we land on the runway here. So anyway, that winter, at that time there was a snow machine race from Anchorage to Fairbanks called the Midnight Sun 600. Okay. And back then, in '69, the person that won the race was the one who had a snow machine that could run that long and get to Fairbanks. and snow machines didn't actually go through the snow back then. They just weren't snow machines like we have now. Yeah. So it was actually run on the road. And the road was going to be closed for the race. But Dad had a flight to Eagle that morning, and of course, we needed the road to take off on. So the race, I think, was supposed to start like 8 o'clock in the morning. And so Dad was going to leave early. And so Dad had Mike Molshan, a guy from Eagle, and a whole load of stuff. And he had a big load, and it was a 180 on skis. And so he needed room to take it off. And even on the road at Cathedral, it was a marginal place to take off because there was a bridge on each side of us not much more, maybe a quarter mile away on each side. So you took off down this hill, and then you took off over the bridge. Down the hill, around the corner. It was an S-shaped thing you took off on over this bridge. and I think the fact that Dad, every other landing or takeoff he was making in that situation, and that made him a good pilot because he got to practice that every day. I mean, there was trees within feet of his wingtip, taking off over the bridge, short takeoff.
Wow. So
anyway, there's three driveways at Cathedral, and the main one in the middle, and then there's one that went up at about a 45-degree angle towards Tok. So if you really needed an extra 100 feet, he'd go up that road, that driveway towards Tok, and then make like a 35-degree acute turn back onto the road, and it gave you an extra little less than 100 feet probably. Yeah. But, when you're dealing with 900 feet, 100 feet is 10% of the runway. So he decided that morning he needed that extra room. So he taxied up there, and as he tried to turn onto the road, it was like, say, 40 below, and the tail wheel was, the grease was a little stiff, and it wouldn't break over. So he's out on the road, but he can't get the tail wheel to break. So I was out there helping. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning. And I ran up behind him and kicked the tail wheel on the 180 to get it so he could turn. Well, just as I'm doing that, I see car headlights coming from Tok. And, I knew that airplane was worth more than my life. So I ran towards the car headlights. But, I'm dressed in a dark jacket and I don't have a flashlight or anything. I'm just a dark kid running down the road. So they didn't see me until I was in the headlights of the car. And they didn't stop. So at the last minute, I dove off to the left, and they actually hit me on the back of the legs and threw me into the ditch. And then they ran through the tail of the airplane. And Dad was crosswise in the road, and they hit the back of the airplane, just double it over by the baggage compartment. Just about the baggage compartment.
Jeez.
and went in the ditch on the right-hand side, and the plane got thrown in the ditch on the other side.
Oh, man. How did that affect your ability to land on the road in the future? Because
Well,
you were
that was
doing this illegally anyway, right?
Yeah, and this was the first time that the troopers caught Dad red-handed. I mean, not only on the road, but caused an accident.
Yeah.
So he got a ticket.
Oh, man.
And so Dad hired an attorney to, and, there was going to be a court date. I mean, I don't know what the argument was going to be, but Dad, was going to fight it. But the court date hadn't come up before he got killed.
Oh.
So, if Dad's looking down on us, I'm sure he's laughing about the fact that the troopers chased him for, a decade, and then they finally got him, and then he just died, so they could never actually pin him.
Wow. Was there anything you had to deal with on that, with the court date, or was it just over at that point?
It was over at that point, because the ticket was against Dad. Yeah. He was actually in a paint pot. He was spray painting an airplane. This is another story maybe we'll get into, is why that airplane
You
was.
can tell that right now if you want. So this is how your father died.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
He was spray painting this airplane, and the paint pot exploded. The regulator was defective, and he thought he had 20 pounds of pressure, and instead he had 150. It wasn't painting correctly. He was looking at trying to figure it out, and the paint pot separated and exploded and hit him in the head.
And it was over.
Well, he was in a coma for 8 months after that, but he never came to after that.
That must have been tough.
Yeah, it was. For my mom, it was a horrible situation. I mean, her husband is in a coma.
She's trying to
run the business. The airplane gets wrecked. It was a horrible situation.
While he's in a coma, are you guys like the brothers suddenly like, whoa, we got to be men here? Was there any kind of weird realization there or anything?
Yeah, I mean, it was that had kind of been our lives. This was a family business that we had worked in. All of us had worked in for years, and so there was really never any discussion about it. These things had to be done. The Warbelow's Air Ventures was a company that my dad started.
Okay.
And it was a single pilot operation, and we had a lodge there and ran gas pumps and a bunch of stuff, and so the air service was a piece of it. So when he got killed, we moved the air service part of it to Tanacross, because the rest of it, nobody wanted to run it. Didn't make any money anyway.
Okay.
So that's how. And we're a bunch of young kids, so we had to change the name.
Why did you have to change the name? Because
we're a bunch of young kids. And,
because you felt like you had to, or you actually had to?
Well, it was my older brother Ron's idea, and it wasn't anything I would have done, but he thought we should call it 40 Mile Air Limited, because that country is called the 40 Mile Air Country, and he liked the Limited.
How old was he at the time?
He was 22, 21 actually.
And he was the old one?
Yeah. Yeah, I was 15 when Dad got killed, and my older brother had just turned 17. And my birthday's June 11th, so a month later I turned 16.
So Charlie is the middle one, and you're the
yeah. He's just 13 months older than I am. Yeah.
So there was a 17-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 20-year-old, or 20.
Yeah, 21. Yeah.
And you guys are doing this.
Yeah. And my Ron didn't have a commercial pilot's license yet. That is a whole separate story, and since he's not here to defend himself, I guess I won't tell all of it. But he supposedly got a commercial license that summer. He had a private. So my mom hired some pilots, which we had never done. We hired a pilot by the name of Tom Jones, who had been down in Bethel. And Tom was difficult and kind of a hotshot pilot. And he bought a 185 of his own while he was at Cathedral with us that summer. And he was a horrible pilot. I remember flying into, there were some people that wanted to go gold mining up near Tibbs Creek, which is off the Goodpasture River. And it's interesting because there was no place to land there, so we landed them at Central. And in between Central and Tibbs Creek is Pogo Mine now, where, they found a lot of gold. And so we thought these guys were crazy to be wanting to go up there gold mining. But anyway, we flew them in there, and Central's not a great runway. But I remember I went with Tom, and we had all the seats out of the 180. And so I was just sitting on a bunch of the mining equipment stuff.
Yeah.
And so he instructed me, he said, when we touch down, let the flaps off. So, and this is the way he flew, two-handed. He came over the end of the runway and he just pulls the throttle off and pulls the stick back. He always made a one-point landing on the tail wheel. And as soon as we hit, I let the flaps off. And that's, and then you just go down the runway until it finally quit bouncing.
Jeez.
And so eventually my mom fired him and hired a guy by the name of Paul Lutz.
Where have I heard that name before?
Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, he was a C-130 pilot, and we hired him to fly a 180. Paul came in with he flew for us for not very long, I think it was a matter of a few days, and came in with the 180, and it was blowing out of the west, so you had to land down the road, or down the runway. And when you landed down the runway, you touch down on the road, roll for 100 feet, and then you just kind of skewer off onto the runway. And you went down a fairly steep hill. Well, he touched down too late and went down, and that was when Cessna first came out with Cleveland brakes, and we'd all had Goodyear brakes before, and they didn't really work. But Cleveland brakes, they work. And so he went down the hill and hit the brakes and just flipped it over. And so that was the end of him.
So when you say it was the end of him, I mean, he got fired, or did he die doing that?
Paul Lutz, no. I think he quit and my mom fired him, kind of, it was a mutual agreement.
I love that one. So, when someone needs to get fired and they know they quit, I quit. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So that was, your mom was involved, and was she involved with when you guys changed it to 40 mile air?
No, we kind of, it was never a case where we sat down and said, this is what we're going to do. It was the kind of case of, there was an ongoing operation. We had, Dad had a mail contract to fly mail into Tetlin from Tok Tuesday and Saturday. He had a contract to fly the maintenance people from Delta Junction out to Gold King Creek, which is actually south of Fairbanks, twice a week. And, there was things were happening. And so, like I say, I never remember any discussion with our mother at all about how this was going to happen. And, I remember when Dad got airlifted out on a BLM helicopter to Fairbanks, then got sent to Anchorage, and Mom went down there. And so I was at the lodge by myself, I guess with my brother Charlie, and some McKinley Fencing stopped by, and they were going to do a project with some guardrails on the bridges there, and they wanted to put a crew there. And I guess I've always been even at I was 15, and I was like, yeah, we'll do that. So they moved a crew in. I think it was about 6 people.
And you're like renting them space or something?
And I agreed to provide rooms for them and meals. And so I remember we used to. These guys probably were wondering. I mean, they knew. There's this 15-year-old kid running the place.
And they didn't know that your dad was dead. They're just like,
I don't know.
He looks responsible.
Yeah. And so we started. I was the cook, but I really wasn't a cook. And I remember I think it was like the first night they came for dinner, and I figured I'd impress them and cook steak. So we had a beef bottom round that we got, like 20-pound things, and it was frozen in the freezer. And I was out there with a meat saw cutting off steaks that were frozen solid.
Yeah.
And I remember the foreman came out, and he looked at it and he was like, "Here, why don't I help you get dinner ready?" But I was very impressed because I had watched my mom and dad do this, and I knew that I charged them $13.50 a day for a place to stay and 3 meals, because I knew that's what my dad had charged the last crew that we had. And so I was like, I'm going to make some money. And yeah, it was, you just did what you had to do, and
That's crazy.
It was an ongoing business, so we just went at it. People in Tok were always very critical of the way we were raised because we didn't get to go to school because they wouldn't send the school bus out there, so we were homeschooled, and we worked, and we didn't have any other kids to play with, and it was like, oh, those poor Warbelow kids are so deprived, and their parents are, But in retrospect, I wouldn't give up my childhood for anything.
Yeah.
As I look back on it, I mean, we, at a young age, we all knew how to run a business, what it was like to work. The homeschooling, we knew how to learn things on our own.
Yeah.
And so
100%.
it was I wouldn't give up that experience for anything, even though at the time I didn't realize how valuable it was. But
so how did your father, why was he painting? Because there's more to that story about how kind of the...
there's a sequence of events that happened. The previous year, there'd been an early snowstorm in the first part of August, actually before the 10th, because it was before sheep season. Mm-hmm. And there was a USGS geologist by the name of Helen Foster that stayed with us in the summer at Cathedral for 10 years. Mm-hmm. She would base out of there, and Dad flew her. And sometimes she would have military helicopters, the old H-21 Bananas, based there, a Bell 47 or something. Yeah. So that was her base of operations, and she mapped and did geological work in the 40-mile country. And Dad had dropped her off at a place called the Kink, which is a place in the 40-mile river where the river comes around and almost touches itself, and the miners had dynamited through that so they could mine the kink in the river. They drained it, so there was a falls there. And Dad had found a gravel bar that he could land on there. And so he had taken Helen and her assistant, Joe Laird, in there and dropped them off with backpacks. And they had backpacked for like a week. And then Dad was going to resupply them there. And they were going to continue on. He was going to pick up the rocks and stuff and give them, some new food and stuff. Well, he went in to get them that day, and there'd been a snowstorm. And it was snowing when he got there. And so he landed, and it was like, a really heavy snowstorm. So they're sitting there waiting, and Helen decided that they wanted to just leave. They didn't want to continue because it looked like, So Dad was a single pilot, so he, and it was right at the beginning of hunting season where he was very busy, and he didn't really have time to fly them back out of there. Mm-hmm. It was an hour flight back to Cathedral, or 45 minutes maybe. So he decided to fly them both out at once in a Cub. So he loaded them up, and by this time, the wings are covered in snow, so they took Helen's rain pants and threw them over the wing and pulled the snow off. But, the wings are still contaminated, as you can imagine, wet snow. And he loaded up Helen and Joe in the back seat of the Super Cub, their 2 packs, the rocks they'd collected, and the gear that he'd brought in, to resupply them.
Oh, man. This is a lot. It's like 3 loads of Super Cub.
In a 150 horse Super Cub with this is back, and this is why the picture is interesting to look at, because, the plane is a stock Super Cub with a 74 or 54 prop on it, this is before bore props and stuff, 25-11-4 Goodyear tires, it's just a stock Super Cub. Mm-hmm. And he took off, and he got in the air, but then he touched the water, and then it went into the water. Mm. But anyway, they ended up on the wrong side of the river, and they ended up in the river, and bailed out of the airplane, everything floated out of it. They got it pushed up on the bank on the other side, and then Dad. This was before ELTs, of course, and Dad always left instructions with Mom that if he didn't come back, she was to do nothing for 24 hours. I mean, the rule was you couldn't even call anybody and tell them that Dad was missing. Because he said, in 24 hours, I can get out of anywhere.
Cool.
So, so they didn't expect, they weren't waiting around there to be rescued by anybody. Mm-hmm. So they started walking immediately for chicken, which was about, 30, 40 miles. And it's not like there's a trail there.
Right. You're just walking down a river trying to get by cut banks and...
Yeah, so they're walking through Well, they walked up a creek, and I guess they had a little, Helen was a very competent outdoors
I
person.
imagine.
And she knew the country really well. She wanted to get up on a ridge, and I guess there was some difference of opinion about how they should get out of there.
Yeah.
But they did, Helen won the long run, and they went up
That's
on
good.
the ridge. And they ended up walking over a mountain that actually later was named after my dad, Mount Warbelow up near Chicken. And they got out of there eventually. They walked out to Chicken. And
So it took them by the time they got out, the rescue or the realization that your mom.
yeah, the 24 hours was up, and Mom had notified Bob and Ellis Roberts, who are good friends that ran the Chevron bulk plant. And they went out with their airplane, and they found the cub. And because the sleeping bags they had gotten wet in the water, they'd stretched them out underneath the wings to dry. Well, they flew over, and it looked like there was bodies underneath the wing. So,
And they didn't land.
no, they didn't land. And so, but eventually, Bob and Alice had grown up around Chicken. They were gold miners. And so they kind of knew where they would have gone, and they found them walking to Chicken, and they eventually waited until they got to Chicken and got out of there.
Wow.
So later that fall, we went up and we had to retrieve the airplane, but it sat there until after hunting season. And then we went up with 206 and dropped 55-gallon drums in a frame that Dad made, airdropped it, and then we went in with the other cub.
So was one of you in the back, pushing the drums out? Who was that?
It's interesting you asked that, Dan, because I was kind of a little heavy set when I was a kid.
Okay.
And so we got all this stuff crammed in the 206 and got the rear door off it. And so then Dad's like, okay, I was supposed to go. But I couldn't fit myself in there with all of this stuff. So my brother got to go.
Charlie?
Yeah, on the flight with the barrels. I did go up later and drop some of the rest of it. But anyway, we airdropped that, went in there, built a raft, rolled the cub onto it, floated across the river. And of course, the raft then grounded out, broke apart in the middle of but it was in shallow enough water that we were able to get it to the middle part where we could put a new prop on it and taped up the wing and flew it out of there.
Wow. So, but there was enough wrong with it that it wasn't intact. You're flying a wrecked airplane out.
Yeah, the wing and I'm trying to think which wing it was. I think it was the right wing had gone underwater and clasped a bunch of the ribs and messed things up. And of course, you got the prop. So, but it was flyable. I mean, taped it up and flew it out. And
when you say, can you elaborate on that? Taped it up. What does that mean?
Well, duct tape. You just take duct tape and start taping fabric together. And
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. What you mean by tape it?
you always carry a little duct tape in your Super Cub just in case. I have an interesting story about that too to tell you. But anyway, so the Cub it was a 61 Cub, and this was 1970. It's cotton cover, so he decided to recover it, and that's what he was recovering when the paint pot blew up. And
What a crazy sort of connection there with that story.
that happened in the summer of 1970. We were there the winter of 1970, and then the following spring we started moving down to some land that we bought down near the Tanacross runway. There was actually some land that my dad, it was Pump Station K on the Canole pipeline.
Okay.
That was the 3-inch pipeline that they built during the war from, I can't remember the name, but there's a place in Canada up northeast of Whitehorse where there was oil. And the oil was so light that they could just basically boil it and make avgas and diesel fuel out of it. And so during the war, they built this pipeline because they were afraid the Japanese would cut off the shipping along the coast. So there was a pipeline, the Canole pipeline, from the Mackenzie River, Norman Wells, to Whitehorse.
That's the name of the pipeline, the Norman Wells?
No, the place where the oil, it's an island in the middle of the Mackenzie River.
Got it.
And where the oil wells were. And then they took it to Whitehorse, and I believe it was refined in Whitehorse. And then it was sent on this 3-inch pipeline to Alaskan. And there was pump stations along the way. And Pump Station K was the one right by Tanacross there. And actually, Pump Station K was never activated. It was built, but it never pumped oil, interestingly.
Wow.
This all happened just in the course of a couple of years before they built the Userol pipeline after the war, the 8-inch pipeline. So anyway, they surplused that land, and Dad bid on it because Charlie and I were, 15, 16. He could see the writing on the wall that all his help was going away because Ron and Cindy were at the university at that time. And so, he had a year or two before he didn't have any help, and he really couldn't run the place.
Any help meaning?
Well, we were the workforce.
Yeah.
They never hired anybody.
Yeah.
We were the unpaid help.
Yeah.
And so his idea was to buy this land, which was near the Tanacross runway, and avoid this problem of landing in the road and the runway that wasn't any good. And moved this trailer house down there, and he and Mom would live down there, and I think he thought he could operate by himself there. But he didn't win the bid. Northwest Pipeline bought it.
Got it.
And so we bought it from Northwest Pipeline.
We being?
Charlie and Ron and I, the following couple of years later. So the summer of, I can't remember exactly when we bought it, whether it was probably it was the winter of 1971 maybe. And so our plan was, without really our mom's approval, we just kind of said, this is what we're going to do.
And you guys had enough money to buy a piece of land between the three of you? You pooled your resources?
Well, yeah, we, starting the fall of 70, we kind of took over the economics of the air service, which is pretty generous of my mom.
She let you do it? She just...
Yeah, and it was kind of a situation where she didn't want to do it. She couldn't do it. She wasn't a pilot. And she kind of had a fill of hiring pilots that wrecked airplanes that summer. So the fact that we wanted to take this thing off her hands and, deal with these contracts and so on, it just kind of happened.
Wow.
And yeah, we didn't really have any overhead because, Dad lived in a cash world. He'd never borrowed a dollar in his life. So, our inheritance became a wrecked 180, two wrecked 180s actually. 1967 206, a wrecked Super Cub, and a flying Super Cub. And that kind of became our inheritance from this whole situation. That's what we started the operation with.
So your dad dies, you guys kind of go through a string of pilots, everything, all kinds of drama there with those pilots. And then eventually Ron starts flying, and I mean, all three of you are flying. What was that like? Because it sounds to me like this road takeoff and landing is not a good place to learn how to fly.
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about what happened that summer. So, for my 16th birthday, 11th of June, Mom gave me a pilot logbook, and I'm going to go learn to fly with Dan. And so we're going to do this at Tanacross, which is an old World War II runway. There's two 5,000-foot paved runways there, and then a connecting taxiway. And we never let Dan Grab, the instructor, fly the airplane out of Cathedral because it was a short runway, and he was a 250-hour pilot. And so my brother, Ron, would fly the Cub down to Tanacross, and then we'd meet him down there to do the instruction. So I started instruction on, I'll have to look here and see when it was. It was about the first part of, I guess I took my first lesson, the 13th of June. So my birthday was 11th.
Which year is it again?
1970. So I got this logbook for my 16th
so
birthday
cool.
2 days before. And on the 13th, I went down and took my first flight. And what's interesting is that between the 13th of June and the 16th of July, I accumulated 8 hours of time. And on the 16th of July, Dan took me up for a 15-minute dual flight, and then he soloed me.
So you had
8 hours and 15 minutes in the Cub.
Wow.
And you might think that my dad had taught me how to fly or something, but I had put my hand on the control on the Cub one time with my dad. We were flying from Cathedral down to Tanacross, I don't remember why, and Dad asked me if I wanted to try flying it. And I said, okay. And so I grabbed hold of the stick, and he didn't tell me anything about how to fly, and I assumed that you had to move the stick around. So I like churned the stick like I was making butter with the stick.
Well, you got to do something.
We had to do something, and then I was excited, and I'm like, and the plane starts going like this, and I don't remember. I don't think it was more than probably 15 seconds. My dad was starting to get nauseated, and he was like, "This kid's not too sharp."
Yeah.
And he's like, "Oh yeah, I'll take it." And that was the one and only time that I ever touched the controls in an airplane with my dad. So Dan solos me with 8 hours and 15 minutes. And, I'd like to, I guess I should say I'm an amazing pilot. I learned how to fly in 8 hours and 15 minutes in a Cub. But what's interesting is the next flight we made was on the 19th. So 6 days later, we did some takeoffs and landings. And then he turned me loose for a second solo flight. On that flight, he was standing on the ramp at Tanacross where the old World War II hangar used to be. And that ramp runs parallel to the runway that I was landing on. And in between the ramp and the runway, there's a berm. I think they, probably during World War II, they pushed the dirt from the ramp and the dirt from the runway up in between them and just made a berm there. That berm was pretty high. You couldn't see the runway from the ramp. Well, I went out and made a landing, and I lost control of the airplane, and I ground looped. And it's a paved runway, so, on the pavement, I started to hook around, but fortunately, I went off the pavement before the ground loop got fully developed. And the whole area down there around Tanacross is an ancient lake bed. And there's rocks about this size, and there's very little dirt, so it's just like a bunch of ball bearings. And when I went off into that gravel, it spun around, but it didn't go up on the wing. And, I don't think Dan had ever talked to me about what a ground loop was, but I found out what a ground loop was.
Yeah.
And I pulled back out on the runway, and I took off. And I made some more touch and goes.
Just kept going.
And when I came back, Dan didn't say anything. And I didn't say anything. So he never knew that I ground looped it. And I think what it demonstrates is that obviously I didn't know how to fly the airplane. He shouldn't have been soloing me with eight hours in a Cub. And he, 4 months later, early November, died with a student in a Aranca Chief in Tok. So, in retrospect, I'd like to sit here and say I was a great pilot. I learned to fly a Cub in 8 hours. But like we had talked before, sitting here now, I realize, damn lucky that, I didn't know enough. I should have told Dan, no, I won't fly this solo. Because I obviously didn't know how to fly the airplane. I ground looped it the next time I went up. I wasn't competent to fly the airplane.
Yeah.
But he told me I was, so I went and flew. And then, 4 months later, he dies with another student in an airplane. And you look back on it now and realize, I'm lucky that he didn't kill me in that thing. My most compelling memory of Dan Grab is doing power on stalls with him in the Cub, which, we did the second hour we flew. And I remember him, we didn't use the headset or anything. And so we're doing full power stalls. And of course, I don't, usually one of the wings falls off and you start a spin. And I remember me like, whoa, what's... And Dan just laughing in the back seat at the top of his lungs.
You're spinning?
Well, not spin, but, a wing drops off. And he's just bellow laughing in the back seat.
He loves it.
Doesn't touch the controls, just is laughing at me trying to recover from this power on stall.
Wow. Okay, back to you and your brothers. What's boggling my mind, you would ask me, are you going to make me talk about that? If you will talk about it, did your brother fly commercially without a license? Without a commercial license?
Well, he went to Fairbanks, and Ron had gotten his private there, and I don't know where he went to get his commercial in Fairbanks. But he went to Fairbanks, took some time, took a check ride with a guy by the name of Dave Tucker.
Okay.
And flunked it. And then Ron's story was he went over and there was a guy set up on Phillips Field in an ATCO unit that was an examiner, and he took a check ride from him. Like I say, Ron's not here to defend himself, so I don't know just what did happen. But the bottom line is, it turned out that the temporary pilot's license he had was bogus. And
who knows how it was bogus? Someone gave it to him. He created it.
Yeah,
We don't know.
I don't know.
Okay.
Just what, and you had to know my brother you never could really believe everything Ron said. So he came back and said he had a commercial pilot's license and started flying. You know, we got rid of all these other pilots and he started flying commercially. Well, he never got a permanent pilot's license. And, you know, sometime later, 6 or 8 months later, the FAA was like, hey, what's going on here? You haven't got a license. And so this whole thing blew up, and Ron worked out a deal with the FAA. He went and retook the check ride, and it all blew over. But
Amazing.
he didn't have a check ride. I mean, he didn't have a license for the first 6 months he did commercial flying.
That's a very common, that's not uncommon back then, for people to start flying and then the FAA catch up to them and then they...
Yeah, this is a little unique because Ron claimed he had a license.
Right.
What's interesting is the following year, I went to Fairbanks I flew just on my student pilot's license for the first year. And then I went to Fairbanks the following summer to get my private once I turned 17.
Yeah.
And I went to Northland Aviation, which was the Citabria deal at the time, because I wanted to get my private in a tail dragger, which is a stupid thing to do. You know, getting a license and learning to fly bush flying in Alaska are two separate issues.
Yeah. You need to get licensed, then...
Yeah, so the idea of, getting a license in a Citabria that, has a spring steel gear, and I've made the worst landings I've ever made in a Citabria, I think. And, the airplane didn't have a full panel, so it's got a needle and ball in it. So you're trying to take a private check ride with a needle and ball and a watch and, And so I went in, and Bill Lynch was an instructor, but they didn't have an examiner. So Bill gave me a recommendation ride, and then guess who I took my private pilot check ride with? Dave Tucker.
I'm sorry, remind me.
The same examiner who'd flunked my brother on his commercial the previous year. So I went over and took the check ride in a Citabria. And, I guess I should say, I think it's important. It's kind of embarrassing to be sitting here like I'm an old-time Alaska bush pilot, and people might actually think that, I've got some special skills. And, I got a 72 on my private pilot written. I flunked my private pilot check ride.
Yeah.
I should have killed myself in my solo. I had an idiot for an instructor that killed himself a few months later. It's interesting when you look at the roots of this.
Yeah.
And so I flunked the check ride, and I was upset. And Dave said, well, he says, what you should do. He ran a flight school, a competing flight school right beside Northland, out of an ATCO unit. It was an ATCO unit that he had. And he said, you should come over and fly the 150. We got a full panel in it, and So that's what I did. I went over, and I'd never flown a tricycle gear airplane in my life. And I went up one day, and we did 3 flights. I think 2 that were actually flights. None of them were. Some of them were sub 1 hour. So I had something maybe 2.5 hours in the 150. The last flight he did a recommendation ride, and I went out the next day and did the check ride with Dave again in the 150, and I passed. And we went back in the ATCO unit, and he filled out the temporary and handed it to me, and I got that firmly in my hand. And I was like, you son of a bitch. I don't think I said that, but I said something like that. And
why?
I said, I can't fly that Citabria any better than I could, before I came over here. Now I'm legal to go out and fly passengers in it. But you flunked me in it, He's like, well, if you feel that way, you should go take some more time in it.
Was there a sort of progression of what you learned? Because your dad, you learned probably watching him, but you guys didn't have someone to teach you off airport, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question because, I watched a little bit of the Ron Hayes film, and he talked about having a mentor,
Yeah.
another guide, I think, that
Yeah.
taught him down in the Besna area there.
Yeah.
And when I watched that, I was kind of thinking, let's see, who taught me any of this? And I guess it was a result of the way we were raised, too. My dad was a very independent, anti-authority kind of guy. Mm-hmm. Dad felt like he not only had a right, but he had an obligation to, screw with the government. He wouldn't have called it stealing from the government. He would have called it tax recovery. So any opportunity he had to whatever, the government was free game. It was fair play to mess with them.
Could you give me one example?
Well, Dad had a very adversarial relationship with the FAA, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. And I remember one time he had some work done on the trim in the 170, and they'd gotten the trim cable reversed. So when you trimmed it back, it trimmed it nose down, and you trimmed it up, it trimmed it, the opposite. And so Dad, he was the only one that flew it. So he was like, okay, well, I know how the trim works. So he didn't do anything about it. And one time the FAA stopped at Cathedral there, and like I said, Dad had a horrible relationship with them, mm-hmm. and they wanted to inspect an airplane. Mm-hmm. And so Dad said, yeah, you can look at that 170 there. And he said, you can look at it all day, and there's something unairworthy about it, and you'll never find it. Just baiting them.
He said that to them?
Yeah. And
kind of like a challenge?
Yeah, that was it. Look all you want. It's on there with you, and you'll never find it. And I'm gonna fly it tomorrow on a commercial flight.
Oh my gosh!
And that's the kind of it's like landing on the road. I mean, it was convenient, but Dad enjoyed that kind of stuff. Dad had eagle eyes, and the territorial police back in the old days, and the troopers later, they'd hide, drive their car off on some side road up the Cathedral there, and Dad would fly over, and he'd find them. Every time. They never caught him. And Dad enjoyed that kind of relationship.
So it was like just part of the fun for him.
Yeah, it was just part of the fun. Just mess with. That's why I think, the idea of dying when he had a ticket would have just made his day. This would have been the ultimate way to screw the state. You got a ticket, but you're never going to prosecute it because I'm just going to die.
I love that you have that you can sort of laugh at that, or it's just.
And the problem was that we inherited that. I grew up steeped in that culture.
Yeah.
And the first interaction I had with the FAA itself on my own was in the fall of 1970, and after this 180 got flipped over with Paul Lutz, that had a set of hydraulic wheel skis on it. Well, we bought a replacement airplane, but we needed the wheel skis off of 93 Yankee to put on 07 Mike. So it's maybe late September of 70. I'm at Cathedral by myself, and I said I'm going to work on this project. So we never had a hangar. So I'm out there in front of the lodge with this new 180, and I've got a 1/2-inch electric drill with a 1/2-inch bit in it, and I'm drilling holes down by the gearbox where the hydraulic fittings go through. Mm-hmm. And a government car drives up. And they stop, and they get out, 3 guys, and it's the FAA. And they're like, what are you doing? And, I'm 16 years old, don't have an A&P license. I knew that was probably a problem. And so I just fell back on what I'd seen my dad do. Mm-hmm. And I said, this is private property. Get the hell off of here. Mm. And they got in their car and left.
Boom.
I never heard anything more about it.
Wow. That's so funny.
So we inherited that kind of a relationship with the FAA.
And so when it comes to a flying mentor or someone to teach you guys off airport and doing it safely, you didn't have anyone?
No, and Ron, my older brother, who, when you looked at that picture, he said, is that you? Because we looked a lot alike. Yeah. We talked on the phone, people couldn't tell us apart. Mm-hmm. But Ron and I were always, I'm the youngest, he's the oldest son, he learned to fly, some years before I did. So he had more. He didn't have a lot of experience, but he had a couple hundred.
But he
more
at least
hours.
had some mentorship from your dad, probably, right?
Dad was an instructor, so he never taught any of us how to fly.
Yeah, but he
he at least talked with him. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And you know, we'd all been around watching Dad. We were his ground crew, so we'd been steeped in this kind of a culture. But you know, after I was looking in my logbook, you know, I went up on the Robertson River that fall that I had my student pilot certificate, and I remember doing this. I have a picture of where I landed. I found a gravel bar and landed on it with 804 tires on a stock Cub, and thought I was a bush pilot then, you know, because I'd landed on a gravel bar. But yeah, it was pretty much a case of just learning on your own. And like I say, that was the way we'd gone to school by correspondence. Dad didn't, you know, when he needed to learn something, like I remember he bought a Lincoln Weldon Power welder, but Dad didn't know how to weld. But he was too proud to ask anybody how to weld. And this 10 by 50 Wolverine house trailer that I talked about that we used as a motel unit, we bought that in Delta Junction, and we had a 2.5 ton GMC flatbed truck, 1959 truck, that we used to haul fuel from Toke in barrels for the gas pumps. And Dad, you know, that was our work truck. We used it for everything. Well, Dad wanted to haul that trailer back from Delta with the flatbed, but didn't have a hitch on it. So he decided he was going to weld up a hitch. But Dad needed some angle iron. And at that time, the bridges at the end of the guardrail would have a piece of angle iron sticking up that was painted white with a black top on it, so the snowplow would know where the end of the guardrail was so it wouldn't hit it. So Dad, you know, there's a bridge on each side of it, so Dad just went down and bolted those angle iron and welded up a hitch out of them. So, you know, as he's driving down the road, you can see these white pieces of angle iron
Looks a
with
lot
black
like a
ends.
bridge.
It's pretty obvious where these things came from. But this is, like I say, this is my dad's feeling that, you know, this is tax recovery program. I need some angle iron. The government has some here on the end of these bridges. I'll just help myself to it.
Yes, I love it.
So anyway, we welded up this hitch, drove up to Delta. Three of us boys went. We took the skirting off this trailer and put the wheels on it and hooked it up. And Dad let us ride in the trailer. So his 3 sons are in this trailer, and we're going down the road
With this hitch that he's welded up. Oh my.
Well, about halfway back, the hitch failed.
Hey guys, we'll get right back to the interview, but first, let's talk about the easiest way that you can support us in making more content like this. So this program is self-funded, meaning if you want to support us, all you have to do is go to my company's website, sportaircraftseats.com. We make aircraft seat upholstery kits that can be installed by an owner or mechanic in just a few minutes with little to no skill. Now, the process that we have created is very easy. You can design and order the seats right on our website. We'll then make them according to your customizations and what seat frames you have, and we'll ship them right to your door. We have instructional videos that show you every step of the installation process and a comfort and fit guarantee. Click the link in the video description or go to sportaircraftseats.com to check us out.
So his 3 sons are in this trailer, and we're going down the road.
With this hitch that he's
With this
welded
hitch.
up. Oh my.
Well, about halfway back, the hitch failed. And of course, there's no safety chains on the trailer, but it didn't completely fail. It just kind of bent down like this. And I don't know how Dad knew it had bent, but he stopped, and you know, it was about ready to come off the ball. And so we unhooked it and left it alongside the road and drove back to the cathedral, and he welded some more on the hitch, scabbed some more stuff onto it, scabbed a spring off of like a D6 cat that was laying around there, and that didn't bend. And we went back and got the trailer.
I love this.
But,
I love that.
You know, I think now how my daughter won't even let me take one of my grandkids from her house to my house on a residential road without a child seat.
Yeah.
And you know, here we are riding the back of a trailer, just walking around in the trailer while we're going down the road with a hitch that Dad welded together that he didn't know how to weld.
It's so funny. It's not even the bridge steel. It's like a sign steel.
Yeah. It's just some. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. So when you guys started learning to fly and flying customers around and everything, and you're landing on gravel bars, and you're just kind of, can you talk to me about some of those stories about kind of how you came up and developed your craft?
The summer of 70, I was a student pilot, and the summer of 71, I got my private. So once I got my private, I'm kind of feeling like I got a license. And, I guess the statute of limitations have expired, and I really don't care anymore. So because Ron and I looked a lot alike and sounded the same on the phone, and Ron was our only pilot, and we had more business than he could do. So, occasionally I would step in and do some.
You guys just got to make sure that you're not in the same place at the same time, right? If you're flying.
Right, yeah. I did do some flying, and eventually the word got back to the FAA that maybe I was, doing some things I shouldn't be doing. And about December, in fact, I brought the letter. Maybe we can include it with this. I wrote a letter to the FAA in Washington and asked for an exemption to the age requirement to get a commercial pilot's license. And I knew that you had to prove public need and necessity to get this kind of an exemption. So I made my best case in this letter and sent it to the FAA in Washington. About a month later, I got a letter back, which I have, maybe include, from Mel Derry, who is the acting chief general aviation operations branch of the Flight Standards District Office in Washington.
How old did you need to be at the time?
18.
You needed to be 18.
And I was 17.
Wow.
So this was December 23rd, 71 that he sent me this letter. So
you're talking about only buying yourself like
6 months.
6 months.
Yeah. But I was, it's a long time when you're 17.
Yeah.
But the last paragraph, he says, 18 is the minimum age for issuance of a commercial pilot certificate. However, the regulations do not prohibit taking the prescribed flight test for the certificate before reaching that age. If this is done and the test is passed, the applicant could be issued the certificate without further testing when he meets the minimum age requirement. So with that, I went to Anchorage and went to Wilbur's on Merrill there and started my commercial instruction. And I didn't mention to him that I was only 17. So I took some instruction, and at that point, I think I had about 150 hours or so. And I only took, I think, maybe 15 hours of instruction there. And the instructor said he'd recommend me for the ride, so he recommended me. And I went over to his office with all my stuff and went in, my logbook and the recommendation stuff, and gave it all to him, and we're scheduled to go for a check ride. Well, he looked at everything, and he said, "You're not 18." And I said, "No, but I have this letter." So I pulled that letter out and showed it to him. And he looked at it, and he said, "Well, you may have a letter," but he said, "I'm not giving you a check ride." He said, "If you want a check ride when you're 17, you better go chat with the FAA." So I went over to the FSDO and told them I wanted to get a commercial check ride, and they said, "Well, we don't give commercial checks. You have to get them from a designated examiner." I said, "Well, I'm taking it at Wilbur's, and they won't give it to me because I'm not 18. And Bill Queen was the guy I was talking to, and he said, "Yeah, you can't take a check ride when you're 17. And so I pulled the letter out and showed it to him. He's like, "Wow, this is signed by Mel Derry." And he went in the back office.
Is Mel Derry, who is that like someone of importance? I mean, is it just...
Yeah, the letter signed Acting Chief, General Aviation Operations Branch, Flight Standards Service.
Wow. Okay, so Mel Derry's...
He was known. Bill Queen knew who Mel Derry was.
Got it.
And so he went in the back office, and there was some discussion. He came out and said, "Okay, we'll give you a check ride." So he gave me a check ride. And so that was, I think, in February of 71. And so that kind of terminated my flying because I didn't, I knew the FAA was kind of on me, and I didn't want to jeopardize. I had a license then, a real license.
Yeah.
So I just timed out until June 11th and went to the FSDO in Fairbanks, and they issued me a license.
Wow. That must have felt good, huh?
Yeah, it was. It was
like,
good.
whoa.
I was off and away, and I was looking at my logbook the other day. I mean, I started flying for BLM, and I did a lot of flying that summer. I mean,
when is your birthday?
June 11th. You know, it's
Jeez.
interesting. Like I say, it was instructive. I hadn't looked at this logbook in 50 years, and I went back and looked at it. And here I am on the 9th of July in 72. So I would have just had a commercial pilot's license for less than a month. And I logged 10.10 hours doing BLM flying. And on the 10th, the next day, I logged 10 hours and 30 minutes.
In a day?
Yeah, in a day.
Dude,
And the next day, I flew 9 hours and 25 minutes. I mean, I think even back then, you were limited to 8 hours a day.
And you're putting it in your logbook. That's so funny. That logbook, that's the interesting thing about that logbook is that there's things that aren't legal in it.
Yeah,
right?
documented
And you were
it
just, I love it.
I'm looking at it. I mean, I don't remember doing that. I'm like, 10 hours? Why would you document 10 hours and then write right on it, BLM Fire Patrol?
Well, the other thing about this is it really doesn't matter if you log your hours, right? Because you're not like vying for like an airline job. You've got to be one of the quickest people to go fly a job like this, right? Because most people, they get in and they can't even get a job flying.
Right.
You're 18 the second you get it. You're doing 10 hours for BLM. That's
flying, yeah.
That's just nuts. I love it.
You know, it was, at that time, you didn't have to have a 135 check ride. And I don't know when that happened, but it happened right after. I mean, I flew the first year just on my commercial check ride. And I think it was the following year that the regulations changed and you had to have an annual check ride. And I took my first check ride with Felix Thomas from the Fairbanks FISDO, and we called him Tom Tom. And Tom Tom was a retired Marine, and you had to be careful when you shook hands with Tom because if he got you down on the fingers, he'd just break your fingers. And he was a Marine through and through. He had a buzz haircut, built like this. And like I say, when he shook hands with you, if you were talking, you were, you know. And so I went to take this check ride, and I probably had, I don't know, I probably had 700-800 hours at that point. So we went down to the end of the runway. First takeoff, Tom says, show me your best short field takeoff. Well, I took the bait, you know, and so I'm like, I'm a pretty good pilot.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And I'll show you that I know how to fly a 180. So, it's just the two of us in the airplane. So we head down the runway. I got 2 notches of flaps on. And when it gets to the point, and I did know, I mean, I'd flown that airplane, all my time was in that airplane. And I, arguably knew how to fly it. So when it got to the point where I knew it would lift off, I didn't pull 3 notches of flap, but I pulled, just kind of used that to rotate, got in the air, it lifted off, and then I launched for the 50-foot obstacle because it was a over the obstacle takeoff. And just as I got to the 50-foot obstacle, Tom reached over and just pulled the throttle off, the idle.
Jeez.
I'm 50 feet in the air, below power on stall speed. I don't remember whether I pushed the stick forward, pulled it back. I think I pushed it forward first and then back. It didn't really make any difference. We were just going to fall 50 feet. And we made probably the highest bounce that I've ever made in my life.
Dude, how did you keep from just basically completely wrecking the airplane doing
Well, that's a good question.
I mean, that's kind of, isn't that kind of reckless on his part?
I would say so. I mean, it's interesting you bring that up because, I mean, we made 2 or 3 oscillations, finally got stopped. I looked over at Tom, and he's looking out the passenger window kind of snickering. My memory is that neither one of us said anything. He just said, do another takeoff, and gave me another maneuver to do.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I don't think he said anything. And so we took off and we completed the check ride. And in retrospect, I would say it was a very gutsy thing for Tom to do. Yeah. And we could have wrecked the airplane. First off, I was stupid to have done that kind of a takeoff.
Yeah.
There's a procedure in the Cessna POH, how you do a short field takeoff, and that's what you do on a check ride.
Yeah, you don't do the actual you're off airport.
No, you do not do what I did.
Yeah.
So, but what was interesting was we hated Tom Tom. I mean, we hated him with a passion. Probably 35 years later, I'm in Fairbanks running Warbelow's Air Ventures, big commuter operation, and I was upstairs in the office, and they rang me on the intercom from downstairs, and they said, "There's somebody here that wants to see you." So I walked downstairs, and here's Tom Tom.
Really?
I hadn't seen him in 30 years.
Yeah.
And he looked just like he did before. You know, that Marine look, buzz haircut. We shook hands. I knew.
You're just like, oh crap.
I knew to get all the way up on him.
Yeah.
And I said, you know, Tom, I said, I used to hate you. But I said, I'm here to thank you for what you did for me. Because I said, you probably saved my life. Because I never forgot what that felt like when that power went off. And I never made a takeoff like that again after that. I mean, you don't do stuff like that. Eventually, it'll kill you.
Yeah.
So, you know, on one hand, I agree with you. It's unbelievable that as an FAA inspector, he did that. But on the other hand, you know, I think he looked at it. Here's a young kid that's a good pilot.
I'm gonna scare the shit out of him.
But I'm gonna teach him a lesson, and he did. I never forgot that. And like I said, it took 35 years before I could say it to him, but I thanked him for what he did.
Did he say anything? Because you guys didn't say anything that day. Did he acknowledge it and go, "Oh yeah"?
He never said anything. I don't remember anything in the debrief after the flight or anything.
But I mean, like, that day when he came into your office 30 years later, when you told him that, was he like, "Oh yeah"?
Yeah, he knew what I was talking about. Yeah. We didn't really discuss it. I just said, you know, you saved my life on that, probably on that check ride.
Let's talk about you and Ron then, as you're going out together, hauling hunters or whatever you're doing. Do you have some memorable stories that kind of explain sort of how the operation ran? With two brothers that probably are butting heads all the time, I imagine.
Yeah, Ron and I we were very competitive. And as the years went on, we got more competitive because in the beginning, Ron was the older brother with more experience, but rapidly I kind of caught up to that. And because Charlie didn't start flying early, Ron and I did all the hunting flying with the Cubs, all the off-airport stuff. So even when Charlie did get his commercial, he didn't do hunting flying. He flew the 180 and 206 and stuff. But yeah, so it was a competitive kind of situation in the flying. So it wasn't a case where Ron was like, I'm the older, experienced pilot, here's how you do it. And I think Ron actually he did enjoy being able to land somewhere and then I couldn't get down. You know,
that sounds like a very safe environment and culture that you guys were cultivating.
And you know, if I landed first, I can never remember a time where I landed somewhere and Ron didn't get on the ground after me. He would run out of gas making passes. And that's what Ron did. If I got on the ground, maybe just because of the way the wind was, and then he got there and he couldn't land, he'd just make pass after pass after pass until he finally hit it just right and he'd land. You know, there was times when he landed and I'd look at it like, I'm not doing this. And I'd go home. And, you know, he'd show up half an hour later, why didn't you land? I'm like, well, you know, the wind was blowing downwind and I couldn't land. And, you know, to him, he liked that. It was difficult for me to keep up with Ron because he did have more experience and had done hunting flying for a year or two before I started flying hunters. So he could land places I couldn't land. And so to kind of even the playing field, I got in the habit, in the fall, I would take the starter, generator, and battery out of my airplane, and I flew, hand-propped it, had no electrical system. And, you know, back then it was a generator, not an alternator. It was a starter that was, you know, this big around, this long, and a, you know, full-size 12-volt battery.
Yeah,
so taking those three things out on the radio, you know, Narco Mark III, you know, it would save me, I think it was like 60, 65 pounds with all that stuff. So every fall I'd take everything out. And so I had to hand prop my airplane. Of course, Ron had an electrical system and a radio. Mm-hmm. So, you know, when we went flying, one thing we could we had like ESP. We could read each other's minds the way we were flying, what we're doing. Because, you know, when you think about it, we each have a hunter. We're going someplace. We kind of didn't necessarily know where we were going when we left. Because at that time, the deal was we always showed people legal game before we landed.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah. So, you know, we would go someplace, and if you couldn't find anything, you might go somewhere else. So you had to signal to the other guy that, and Ron was the leader in those sorts of things. I mean, I deferred to him on, if we went someplace, looked, couldn't find anything, you know, he'd go somewhere else and I'd follow him there. And like I say, it's interesting when you fly with somebody like that for 10 years, especially where you have no communications after you're in the air, how you learn to read each other. And so when we started out, you know, the planes we were using were just stock Cubs. There were no bore props. There were no Alaska bush wheels. These were just standard 150 horse Cubs. And in our stock and trade, well, first off, at that time there was still an Alaska Transportation Commission. Are you familiar with what that is?
Tell me.
So it was a regulated environment. Commercial aviation was regulated like a power utility or a phone company, and you had a license for a certain geographic area.
Oh.
So we had the license to operate out of Tok. Nobody else could get that.
Oh. Okay, that answers one of my questions. All these people coming to if I walk in and there's a 17-year-old kid there pretending that he's his brother, you know, and I'm going to get in an airplane with him. They kind of had to because you guys had the license to fly in that area.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. In our mind, anything on the north side of the Alaska Range to the Canadian border, to certainly to Eagle, to the north side of the Yukon River, to Delta, was ours.
Crazy.
We
in your mind, not necessarily. I mean, like people could go there, but you kind of had the legal. You were the only people that could fly.
Yeah, we're the only people that could commercially fly in that
crazy.
area. And in the way we controlled private people was by not building good runways. So I remember the first time I landed at Rumble Creek with Ron. It would have been the first year I flew hunters. So Rumble Creek was not a very long runway. It was about 250 feet gravel bar, but it's far enough. It's just below the glacier on Rumble Creek, so there's a pretty good grade to the creek there. So even though it wasn't on a ridge, there was quite a lot of grade there. We almost always landed up it and took off down it, unless you had, you know, quite a bit of wind. The problem was if there was 5 knots of wind or 10 knots, maybe 10 knots of wind, it was too much to land up it and not enough to land down. You just couldn't land. If there was 20 knots of wind, you could land down it. But we almost always landed up it and took off down it. And so I went in there and landed with Ron the first time I ever landed there. And the first thing I did was I got out of the airplane, went down to the end of the runway, and I started throwing rocks off. It looked to me like with a half an hour work, I could put on another 20 feet in this thing, and that's 10% of the runway almost. Yeah. And as soon as Ron saw what he was doing, he's like, no, don't do that. I'm like, Ron, this thing is really short. We can make it longer. He said, no, then other people will land here. And so that was it. You know, I mean, at that point, I listened to what Ron told me, and so we didn't extend it. And I realized, I think it was the same year, maybe the next year, we went up to Rumble Creek one day with some hunters. We flew over, and here's a wrecked mall on the end of the runway. It was just far enough off the runway to the side that we landed, and it was Bill Sewell's mall from Salcha, and nobody was there, but the gear was ripped off from it, and it was the side. And Ron was like, "See, this is why we don't extend runways, you know,
so that this will happen."
And you know, we used to we never marked our runways very well, and we didn't mark them with like surveyor tape.
Yeah.
We just moved some rocks around or some logs, and we didn't necessarily mark we set up some reference points, but you didn't want to necessarily
Only ones that you guys know.
that we knew where the reference points were relative to where you wanted to land. So you didn't really want to, eventually you
It's
can
like
see
you were you're doing it in code or something.
right,
almost.
right. But we almost always would leave a windsock, because you need a windsock.
Oh.
So we'd leave a little piece of surveyor tape on a stick. And so after Bill wrecked his maul there, we always used to call that surveyor tape, we called it maul tape. Put up some maul tape over there.
Oh no, poor guy.
Yeah. So, yeah, my dad mostly landed on gravel bars. In fact, as far as I know, I don't really know. There are a couple places I know where he landed on ridges, but 99% of what he did was on gravel bars, and that's the way we started out. And after I'd flown for a few years flying hunters, I started looking at higher places to land.
Yeah.
And I was over on the north side of the Toke River on White Creek, and I got to looking in the bowl, and it looked to me like we could land in the bowl. But it was, it's steep. It wasn't where you couldn't make a go around on it. And it was steep enough that you could get right down on it, but you really couldn't. You could roll kind of on it, but you couldn't really tell much of anything. So I had looked at it, and I told Ron, I said, I think, we were at that house at Tanacross there, and I said, I think we can land in the bowl at White Creek. Let's go up there tonight. It's really calm, and look at it. So he said, no, there's no place to land up there. And I said, I think we can land up there. So I convinced him to go up with me, and we went up, and again, didn't have radios, so I couldn't talk to him. And we both, made some passes on it, and finally Ron went back to Tanacross. The signal was, it's not landable. I'm going home. Follow me. So I went in and landed. And it was, again, it was one of those things where I'd like to say, yeah, I was a great pilot and I figured this out. It was, it was a certain amount of luck, because I'm landing on a place that was one way and I didn't really know what it was.
Yeah.
And so I just came in and landed.
There might be a super deep ditch there or something that you can't see in the lighting.
Yeah, and it was kind of, there was vegetation on it. It was all those little short things that make white cotton stuff, and there was moss, and you really couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it turned out it was really good. And so I landed, put some maul tape out, took off and went back to Tanacross and landed, and I got there like a half an hour after Ron. And I went in the house, and Ron was like, where are you? And I said, I landed. He's like, no, you didn't. I said, yeah, I landed. He said, BS. So we went back out. I said, let's go back. So we went out and flew up there and landed, and Ron landed then. And that was the beginning of our landing on ridges. And so then it kind of became a race to find all these high places to land.
Yeah, so you guys are very competitive about that, I bet.
Yeah, and I don't think Ron really liked these places where you went in one way, but I had liked landing on ridges. I still much prefer to land on a ridge, because the steeper the better. If you can just hit the end of it, you're going to stop and you're going to take off, because if the engine quits, you're going to get in the air. So ridges became my forte. That was where I liked to go, and so I found places on Shindata Creek and Notahone and Stibnite and High Cathedral, and places that 40 Mile that Leif and Randy Rollo and Leif Wilson are still using to haul hunters in there. Yeah.
Tell me about the one, because you were talking about being lucky and luck versus skill. You were telling me a story that kind of related to that I thought was so interesting. And it was about you and Ron landing up in a bowl somewhere.
Oh, yeah, that was actually at White Creek.
So is that the same place that
the first
that I
ridge
made
the first ridge landing? And it was years later. And like I say, when we took sheep hunters out, we showed them legal sheep from the air. And
it was legal at the time to do that, right? It's not legal now.
Yeah,
to do
it was legal at the time. And so we would go out and start looking. Like I say, we didn't have communications between the airplanes, so I would fly until I'd seen a legal sheet, and then I'd land. And Ron always flew longer. And then when he would land, he'd get out of the airplane, and we'd, the 200s get together, and we'd like, Ron would always come out and say, well, what did you guys see? We're like, I saw a ram over there and some ewes over there and blah, 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 and this one was legal, so I landed. He said, did you see the ram over there? Like, no, I didn't see that one. Yeah, there was a big one. It was bigger than the one you saw. Then, did you see the ram over there?
I love it. It's so funny. It's how people are, though.
Yeah,
This is how, everyone does this.
Yeah. Well, it required Ron to always fly a little longer than I did looking for sheep.
Yeah.
He'd always wait until I landed, find another couple sheep, and then, because when we were flying and I'd see him circle, then I'd go over there because I knew he'd seen a sheep.
Yeah.
So he'd always wait till I landed, find a couple more. I think probably he'd fly by some and, put that one in his pocket. I'll circle that one later after it lands so he won't see that I saw that one.
Would he also, when you were fueling up, kind of go put a little extra in his plane so he...
That's an interesting story, and let me tell you that one afterwards. Okay. So anyway, on this particular day, I had landed. Well, I could see that the weather was moving in, and there was a lot of wind up White Creek. And we'd landed there so many times that I could land there with a pretty good little tailwind. And but it was also forming fog in the bowl above where we landed. And so I'm looking at it thinking, this has gone south.
Yeah.
I found a sheep. I'm going to get my hunter in the ground and get the hell out of here before this thing closes in. So I went in and landed. It was probably, 10 knots of 15 knots of tailwind. And got on the ground, and I'm sitting there watching the fog form, thinking you need to get on the ground here, and the wind's picking up. And finally, 10 minutes later, Ron comes in and makes I think he circled. I think he knew what the wind was, but I don't think he, once the mall tape's sticking straight out, it's a little hard to tell how straight out it's sticking. So he came in to make a landing, and he touched down, but it became obvious to him he wasn't going to get stopped. There's like 20 knots of tailwind. And so he made a go-around. And this is not a place, A, it's not a place you can make a go-around. B, it was all foggy in the bowl where he was going to make this go-around.
And you have a tailwind.
And you got a tailwind.
It's terrible.
Yeah. I couldn't believe it. We're standing there on the ground, and I'm watching him come in thinking, you should probably just go back 10 across. I can take off because I'm taking off into headwind. If I'd been in the air, I would have just gone back 10 across and said, I'll deal with this later. But he came in, touched on, and I'm looking at it like, you're not going to get stopped. And where the ridge ends, it goes into a creek. So, you wreck your airplane. And about halfway up the thing, he firewalls it. And I'm like, this can't possibly end well. He got in the air, went past us, goes into the fog, and we're just waiting for the impact.
Dude, crazy.
And about 10 seconds later, all of a sudden, roar, he comes out of the fog, going the other direction.
So crazy.
If I hadn't seen it, I wouldn't have believed it. If Ron had told me that he'd gone up to White Creek and done a go-around, just any kind of a go-around at White Creek, that he touched down going uphill and then, did a go-around, I would have said, you're lying.
Even without the fog there.
Without the fog. I would have just said, you're lying. You're full of crap. You can't do a go-around loaded at White Creek. He did a go-around loaded in the fog. I have no idea. Maybe we couldn't see the conditions from where we were. Maybe there was room underneath there. I don't know. But from our perspective, he went into the fog. We heard the engine for a while, and then he came roaring back out of the fog.
Dude.
And Ron was, like I said, you couldn't believe everything Ron told you. And Ron was undoubtedly a better pilot than I was. But he did some things sometimes that, he needed his superior flying skills because his stupidity got him into these things.
Yeah, his ego.
Maybe not stupidity, or ego, yeah. Which leads me to the story about the gas. The question is, did he carry more gas? And the answer is no. He usually carried less gas than I did. And so my weight advantage by not having an electrical system, I lost part of it in additional gas because I don't like to fly without gas. I always have enough gas. And back then, a lot of the places we went weren't too far, so I would run the right tank empty at the beginning of hunting season. I'd fill a 5-gallon can. I wouldn't even do it out of the pump with a meter. I'd fill a 5-gallon can, dump it in the right tank, and then I only use the left tank. So, if I ran the left tank dry, I knew I had 40 minutes to get on the ground.
Who taught you that? You just figured that out?
I just figured it out. And, with 5 gallons, and you really can't tell much. Depends on the cub, but the ball, when you're on 3-point, you really can't see anything. So that was my process, and I always carried probably more fuel than I really needed. So one time, we would haul some hunters out, and we landed on Tea Lake Ridge. It's a high ridge up in the 40 mile above Tea Lake. You go up the end of Billy Creek, past Tea Lake, land on top of the ridge. And it was a really good place for moose hunting. So we went in there with a couple hunters, and we'd been doing some other flying up there, because lots of times we would use the 206 to ferry people into like Molly Creek, and then we go up the Cub and make short shuttles.
Yeah.
So I think we'd picked those guys up at Molly Creek, probably, flown over to Billy Creek. So we'd been flying up there all afternoon, and we landed on Billy Ridge, unloaded the hunters, and we're standing there. It's the end of the day, we're done. We're standing there chit-chatting, and Ron says, he says, I'm not sure I got enough fuel to get home.
Ron said that?
Yeah. And we're maybe, maybe 20, 25 miles from Tanacross. I mean, you're talking 15 minutes, 20 minutes at the outside flying. And Ron's like, I don't think I got enough fuel to get home. And I said, well, I got plenty of fuel. But I said, I don't have any way to transfer it. So we're both kind of looking in our airplanes to see what we got. And Ron pulls out a Pepsi can. And he said, I got a Pepsi can. I said, okay. And I'm thinking, this is going to take a while. 12 ounces at a time. So I opened my gascolator and rinsed the Pepsi can out and dumped it out and filled it up. Ron's standing up on top of his Thunder tire, takes his cap off, and I go over and hand him the Pepsi can, and he pours it in, and he leans over and he looks in the tank. He says, I think that should do it.
One?
I don't know whether he was just pulling my chain. I mean, this is the kind of stuff Ron did. I mean, he, doesn't even crack a smile. He looks in there and he's like, yeah, that should be enough. I mean, the implication is I can cut my fuel to 12 ounces. I mean, I didn't say anything. I was just like, fine. I got lots of fuel. I'm not going to run out.
He basically spent his entire life screwing with you, essentially. like he had to have been screwing with you.
Yeah, he had to be. I mean,
he basically said, you need to work on your fuel management skills.
Yeah.
you don't know how much you have within 12 ounces?
Yeah. It was the only time I ever heard him say, I don't think I got fuel to get back. I'd go over, sometimes when I was close on fuel, and we dropped people off and we were ready to head back, I would go look at his gauges, because I figured if his gauges are below my gauges, I'm going to make it home. Either that or we're both going to crash.
You just kind of use him as a gauge.
When he quit, when I see him starting to glide,
then you got to go find somewhere to land.
I'll find a place to land right away while I still got the engine running. And I'd go and look at his gauges sometimes, and I'd be like, I wouldn't fly like this.
Yeah.
Both of them are gone.
You say, hey, Ron, let me just give you a hug before you go. I mean, you're kind of an a-hole, but I just want to give you a hug.
One of the things, this is another example of the kind of stuff Ron do. We're based at Tanacross, which is, very near the Alaska range there. And so a lot of our sheep hunters were in the Alaska range. So when you'd come back from dropping something off, you're at 7,000 feet, 5 miles from home. So you either got to make a high-speed descent, but the more common practice was you come over at 7,000 feet off the range, and you just fly right over the top of Tanacross at 7,000 feet. And when you got over the top of the runway, there's a couple things you do, or you could do a combination of these. One thing you do is you just pull a mixture. slow it up, stop the prop, and do a dead stick landing. The alternative thing was you'd spin down. Just do a spin and you'd spin down. Or if you're feeling adventuresome, you'd kill the engine and then spin down. And of course, I'm flying without an electrical system. Right. So when I kill the engine, I can't start it with a starter.
This is something you do all the time.
Yeah, this is pretty standard procedure. And you might think that this is...
so funny.
It's not a smart thing to do.
Are you landing on the road after this? You dead sticking into the road spot?
Well, no, this is at Tanacross. So it's there's two 5,000-foot paved runways.
Yeah.
What's interesting is we never landed on the runways there. Our hangar was at the end of the taxiway, and there was a long taxiway that you could land on. It was just narrower. But we didn't land on that either. We landed in the dirt alongside the taxiway. Yeah. So we would dead stick in on the dirt, and the game was to be able to land, and you're landing towards the hangar, and you won the game by rolling up to the fuel pumps without,
Yeah, if you have to push your plane, you're...
Yeah, you lost if you had to push the plane.
Okay.
So, have you ever shut your engine off and glide it around like that?
Oh, I do it all the time, yeah. No, I'm kidding. I've never done that. Sorry.
Oh, really?
No, I never have.
Well, if you do it, and you can restart the engine without a battery.
Yeah.
You got to get up close to red line to get it to start because it's on compression.
Yeah.
So, but if you can, you need some altitude to get it restarted. So that's what I used to do. We'd come over, kill the engine, spin down to 3,000 feet, dive it, get the engine started again. And because I usually, sometimes we'd dead stick land, but lots of times I would restart it and land. And so, but Ron always, wanted to prove that he, was a better pilot than I did. So he would always spin lower than I would.
So it's like a game of chicken. You guys are spinning with each other?
We'd just spin, not literally side by side, but we'd be spinning at the same time. And when I'd recover, Ron would always still be going.
Oh my gosh.
He would I remember I got on the ground one time and he said, I got 18 turns in. From 7,000 feet. I don't know how many turns, I don't know where he recovered, but he could do 18 turns going down.
That's crazy.
Yeah. One time, this was before, I think it was before I had certainly before I had a commercial. I don't know that I was a student pilot or private pilot. But we were down at Tanacross. This is when we were still at Cathedral. And we'd gone down to Tanacross in the Cub. I think we were just screwing around. We were on skis. And they don't plow the runway in the wintertime. And Ron came in and decided to do a dead stick landing. But he decided to do it on the taxiway. Well, the problem is that the runway has a long overrun that's cleared. The taxiway, there's trees at the end of it. So he comes in, kills the engine. I'm in the back seat. And we're over the trees headed for the taxiway. And it became apparent that we weren't going to make the taxiway. And so at the last minute, to his credit, he realized we weren't going to make it. And he turned, and we had to go like 100 feet to the side. And by the time we got there, to get on the overrun for the runway, by the time we got there, we weren't flying anymore. And fortunately, there was a lot of snow, and we kind of just like pancaked into the snow. Oh, God.
Do you think that people watching you guys from was this just a common practice for the two of you, or is that what everyone did up there? The spinning down, dead sticking in?
Well, first off, I should point out that we never did this with hunters or people on the ground.
That makes sense.
Tanacross was a deserted runway.
Yeah.
There was no other traffic there. It was one of the other things we owned in that part of Alaska.
Yeah.
That was our runway.
Yeah.
There wasn't any other traffic. There was no people. Nobody saw us do this stuff.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't have done it. If we saw people there, we wouldn't have done stuff like that.
Yeah.
It was all done.
I guess I get that, but the whole idea of here's these two kids that are, I don't know, were you shaving at the time? Yeah. But it just seems so crazy to me now. You would literally never see this anymore, I don't think. But
and in retrospect, on one hand, you could say it was stupid things to do. On the other hand, doing dead stick landings in a Cub in a situation like that, I think is a really good experience. It's like the ground loop that happened when I had 8 hours and 15 minutes. In retrospect, that was a Great learning experience,
Yeah.
as was when Felix Thomas pulled the power on me. You know, those are things that you really learned a lot from. It's
Yeah.
like my dad landing on the road at Cathedral. That's what made my dad a good pilot. He operated from a place where he was making a marginal takeoff and landing every other takeoff and landing. So, you know, I think you have to be careful. You know, I'll tell a story to demonstrate when you shouldn't do this kind of stuff. Many years later, I mean, this was in 1990 when Charlie and I were, you know, operating 40-mile air, and we hired lots of pilots then. We had a young pilot by the name of Kenny Lathrop. Charlie has hired Kenny as a pilot, and Kenny had literally 250 hours. And Charlie's checked him out in the 185. He's doing commercial flying. And so later that fall, it was towards the end of September, I was over in down in the Nabesna River, and you ever been to Orange Hill on the Nabesna River? It's a good runway there. It's a mining runway. So we would ferry out of there with the 206. So I'm hauling hunters into the Nabesna River with the Cub, but I need, you know, more hunters to be brought in, hunters to be taken out, and I need gas. So I called back on the radio and said, send Kenny over with the 185, bring a couple other hunters, tanker fuel over in the wings, and pick up the hunters I brought out, and I'll be waiting at Orange Hill for him. Randy had a VHF video camera, which was new, you know, this was high-tech stuff at the time. So he took his VHF video camera down on the taxiway, on this dirt taxiway where we took off, gravel taxiway, and set it up on a tripod down maybe, I don't know, 700, 800 feet down the taxiway. And Kenny took off over the top of it with the 185. So he's empty, just full tanks. So in the video, you know, he takes off, and he, you know, purposely takes off right over the top of the camera. So it's a spectacular takeoff video of this 185 taking off. So Randy goes down and picks up the camera. I think he was standing down by the taxiway, but off to the side because he didn't want to be in the line of flight of the airplane. And so he picks it up and videotapes Kenny in the air. And Kenny turns around and heads towards Orange Hill. And about a mile away, for some reason, he turned back around and started diving down towards Randy. And this is all on the video. So Randy's standing there videotaping. Kenny comes down, makes a low buzz, and then pulls up in just a vertical maneuver. I mean, he literally climbs vertically in the 185. Goes up and basically does a hammerhead stall. Well, he does a hammerhead stall. That's what he did, to the right. This is the maneuver. Kenny had a T-craft. This is the maneuver. I'd never seen him do it, but people told me later that this is the maneuver he did frequently in his T-craft. But in the 185, he did it to the right, so he didn't really see how low he was until he was well over. And then he saw the runway and realized that he was too low.
Jeez.
And on the video, you can see, Randy zoomed in, so the plane is filling the frame. You can see the elevator all of a sudden just bury up. And the plane never flew again after that. I don't think it ever flew. It wasn't it was below stall speed when he started the maneuver over with the rudder, and it never flew after that. It impacted in the middle of the Tanacross runway, in the middle of 5,000 feet of pavement, and sat there for a few seconds. Then, of course, it was full of fuel, and it blew up. He was killed.
And the point of that story,
and I think the point is that, it's doing things that some people might look at. If you'd been standing on the ground in Tanacross and watched Ron and I doing 18 turns with the engine dead, and then dead sticking onto the pavement, you might say that looked stupid. But, I think we learned a lot from that. And I don't think what we were doing was unsafe. And
it's not like it's going to kill you. It may be a higher risk of bending something, but it's not like it's necessarily going to kill you.
Yeah.
Compared to what? Yeah.
I would argue that what we did what really wasn't risky at all.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always things that can go wrong. Maybe an airplane shows up, you're on final and you got no power and he doesn't see you, and I mean, there's things could go wrong. But it was, I would argue it was pretty low risk, and it was a good learning experience. Right. I personally think that cameras, video cameras, you see all these people with GoPro cameras mounted all over their airplane, it makes my skin crawl. I see these videos on Facebook, and people are doing things for the camera to put on Facebook.
Exactly.
And you occasionally, I remember seeing one of a carbon cub taking off, I think at an air show. It takes off, he gets in the air really quick and climbs really quick, and then you see the left wing going down. You've probably seen this video, and into the ground it goes,
Yeah.
On a, just no reason at all to do that.
It's the same thing that happened with the story you just told, whereas he probably got a mile away and was like, what am I doing? We just got a cool camera. There's a camera rolling. I got to go back and do,
Yeah.
Like
it was done for the camera.
Impulsive, 100%.
Yeah. And it's so sad because Kenny was a phenomenal pilot. I mean, at 250 hours, I'll agree with Charlie. I mean, he was a natural born pilot. And if he'd lived, he'd be a far better pilot than I am.
Yeah.
But, I think he was 21, 22 years old.
Jeez.
And dies. I had to go down there and meet with his dad that night. And his dad, smoked, was on oxygen, lived in a trailer house. His wife, Alice Lathrop, was a magistrate in Tok. She died a few years before. So here, his dad is, his only adopted son that he's put his whole life into. And he's sitting there sucking oxygen in a house trailer, and I got to go tell him that his son's dead. I mean, he knew. He went out that night. I mean, Kenny's body sat there in the burned wreckage overnight, and his dad, Wes, went out and slept beside it.
That is so heartbreaking. That is crazy.
Yeah, that's, so I don't know. I'm just, cameras and airplanes, if you're going to do that kind of stuff, it's like air shows. I have never gone to the Valdez Air Show.
Yeah.
I would never go and compete in an air show because I'd try and take off as short as I could. And I'd do something stupid like I did with Felix Thomas.
Yeah.
You just, when the chips are down, you do stupid things like that. And it's hard not to. And so yeah, I've never competed in an air show and never would.
Let me look at some notes here. I think we're at a good place to just take a short break.
Yeah, because I need to adjust my hydraulic pressure.
Okay. All right, guys, sorry to cut it short. Part 2 is going to be coming out in about a month. So remember, subscribe so you don't miss out on that. Here's a preview of part 2.
When you're taking off, you're buying altitude with power. It's like going to the store and taking out money and buying something. You're taking out power out of your wallet and you're buying altitude with it. Now sometimes, have you ever gone and you buy something, maybe something especially that you don't need? You go to the store and there's something there and you're like, I really want that. Yeah. And you buy it. And then you come back a week later and it's on sale. 30% off.
Yeah.
And you're like, damn, I didn't even need that last week. I could have just waited till this week and bought it cheaper.
Yeah.
Well, that's what taking an airplane off is like. So you want to buy altitude. And you can buy that altitude at a slow speed, and you're going to pay a lot of money for it. You're going to pay a lot of horsepower at a slow speed. But if you're in a Cub, the cheapest, the altitude is on sale at 73 miles an hour. That's the airspeed that takes the minimum power to keep the airplane in the air. And that's where I want to buy altitude, where it's the cheapest. When I came to, you still hear snow sizzling on the engine, and the wings are pretty much crushed down. There's fuel running out of the wing roots. So I crawled out and tried to stand up, and I was like, "Oh, how can I stand up?" And then I realized I had on Sorel boots, and they were like bent over at 90 degrees. like my ankle is toast. It kind of felt like standing in Jell-O with walnut shells in it.